Also maybe a great time in our country's history where we rethink whether or not we have public schools. Maybe we should not have the government involved in education at all, so parents and teachers and administrators can make those decisions themselves instead of having the government impose it on them, because it is the public school aspect of this that is creating the legal challenge.
That was Fox News' Kennedy saying the quiet parts out loud, arguing, hey, maybe free education for young kids in this country shouldn't exist anymore. Maybe we need to go to a completely private model where only those who can afford education would get educated. That's really what she's saying there. And this was in the context of a discussion regarding a case that's being heard before the Supreme Court. It has to do with a former football coach for a public school who kept praying, who would pray in the locker rooms, and that would coerce other students to pray. So it's this big controversial case that, again, the Supreme Court is currently listening to. I want to get to the shocking moment where Harris Faulkner actually decided to ask, well, what happens to people who can't afford private school for their kids if we do away with public schools? And pay attention to how Kennedy doesn't answer the question.
And what do we do with the people who can't afford private? Like, what does that look like? Because each state allots some money, so they would get that money, I would assume. Isn't that what Florida wanted to do?
Vouchers, that's what Florida
did.
Yeah,
that's what Florida wanted to do.
Yeah, we could entirely rethink. Okay, I'll tell you why I say that. It's because the two most powerful teachers unions in the country are opposed to Coach Kennedy. They are using their heft and their influence to make sure that he loses.
Notice how Kennedy didn't answer that question. And what was floated was like, yeah, vouchers, yeah. We can rely on right wingers who are obsessed with austerity to give vouchers to people who can't afford private schools, and that'll help fund the whole private school situation if they want their kids to get an education. Except we know how that's gonna play out, right? You guys know how that's gonna play out. Anyone who's stupid enough or naive enough to think that the government on a state level is going to funnel money to parents who can't afford private school for their kids for the long term is just, you're not paying attention to what's happening in the country. They want to preserve education for the rich. They don't want public schools because they don't want property taxes they pay to go to public schools. That's what this is all about. And this is what look, the constant attacks on public schools, that revolve around culture war narratives, it isn't even about that particular culture war narrative. That's just an avenue in which they're accumulating power to do away with what little we have left in social spending in this country, including spending toward public education. There's currently a nationwide war against public education, and that war is being waged by the right wing. In fact, a new report indicates that there's a new effort to privatize education in several red states, and they're doing so through legislation that would undermine public schools and replace them with voucher-supported public education. At the end of the day, the real point here is to cut taxes for the rich, and more importantly, to essentially turn the grade school model into a profitable model, opening this up for all sorts of bad actors to get involved and make a quick buck. And it's gonna cost you, it's gonna cost your kids when it comes to their education, and we need to strategize to fight back against it. Now, let me give you the details on what's happening. In these Times reports that many states are looking to install a new form of vouchers called Education Savings Accounts, ESAs. Like strategies to empower charter schools and introduce private school tax credits, ESA programs aim to remove local control of taxpayer dollars and redirect them to private interests with as little public oversight as possible, says public education advocate Amy Frog. Now, the end goal for this, again, is this privatization movement, and it's always been about that. When you see these attacks toward public school boards, when you see these attacks against teachers' unions, understand that the specific attack that they're leveling against teachers unions or public schools is not really what this is about. It's about slowly but surely dismantling the public education system and doing so by manufacturing consent among the electorate, right? You fearmonger about how terrible these schools are, how they're indoctrinating your kids. Oh, wouldn't it be so much better if you had choice? If you had a way of taking your student or taking your kid and putting them in a private school instead? We can support you, we've got vouchers. But as soon as they dismantle the public education system, you think those vouchers are still gonna be available for the underprivileged families that can't afford a private education for their kids? Just try to think 2 steps ahead and understand that what they're trying to do here is essentially make money off education, but also to keep education an exclusive thing that's only available to their privileged kids. Okay, so if you think inequality is bad now, this will certainly exacerbate it. At least a dozen states, including Tennessee, have introduced legislation to create ESAs, heralded as the next generation of school choice by school privatization proponents. Instead of a traditional voucher program, which diverts public money to private schools, ESAs grant public money directly to parents. They send the money directly to parents. This maneuver could help avoid challenges due to state level Blaine amendments, which prohibit state money from funding religious schools. So they've found a loophole that allows for public money, this is taxpayer money, to be diverted into religious organizations and religious schools. And when we talk about private schools, understand that they do not have to abide by certain standards. Private schools can go ahead and teach whatever they want, whereas public schools have oversight, they have certain standards they need to abide by, and if they don't meet those standards, there are gonna be problems. That is not the case with private schools. And as you can tell, a lot of these private schools are also religious in nature. Now, it also removes accountability. Parents in Arizona, where ESAs were the first to pass in 2011, spent more than $700,000 in ESA funds on purchases unrelated to education between July of 2017 and June of 2018. But if the goal is to blow a hole in the state's education budget, that misspending may not matter. So let's talk about what this does to public schools as well. Remember, they're taking the funding that these public schools desperately need. They're taking the funding out, they're diverting it to private schools. And remember, private schools also have a profit motive in mind. Oftentimes the money goes toward religious schools. Remember, the government is not supposed to endorse one religion or the other. So funneling that money to religious schools has some issues when it comes to the Constitution as well, which is why they're doing it through these ESA programs rather than the voucher program. And when you defund the public schools, what do you think happens to the public school? Does the public school perform as well as it would if it was funded appropriately? No, the public school starts to fail. If it isn't failing already, because as we know, many of these red states have already defunded public education. So then it allows for the right wing to point to those failing public schools and say, you see, schools are failing, public schools are failing your kids. Of course, they won't take any ownership of the fact that they've led this charge of defunding the school in the first place, but it works every time because understandably, these parents want to make sure that their kids are getting the best possible education. When you see the schools failing, most parents don't have time to read about the legislation that defunded these schools. They don't. They've got work to get to, they've got kids to raise, they're busy. And so it is a perfect strategy by the right wing to defund, dismantle public education, and then just divert public funds to the institutions they favor.